The metal handcuffs bit into my wrists as Sheriff Sheila pushed me against the patrol car, my neighbors watching from their porches with wide eyes but averted gazes. My tools still lay scattered across my lawn, evidence of my apparent crime. The cold metal of her cruiser pressed against my cheek as she leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper that only I could hear. "You think you can just move into my town and do whatever you want? This place has rules, my rules." She tightened the cuffs another notch, sending sharp pain through my hands. "Nobody cares who you were before. Here, you are nobody." As she shoved me into the back of her patrol car, I caught sight of a folder that had fallen from her cruiser's front seat. The label was partially visible, expunged records. That was when I realized this small-town sheriff was hiding something massive, and in trying to bully the wrong person, she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. The first time I saw my uncle's old farmhouse after inheriting it, I felt a mix of nostalgia and possibility. The white paint was peeling, the porch sagged slightly, and several roof shingles had come loose during the last winter storm. But beneath the wear, I could see the bones of the place where I had spent countless summer days as a child. This was not just a house. This was a chance to start over. I had left my corporate job in the city after a stress-induced health scare and emptied my savings account to renovate this place properly. The inheritance had come at exactly the right moment, when I needed an escape, a project, something real to focus on. Uncle Bill had always told me that Millfield was the kind of place where people looked out for one another, a community where neighborliness still meant something. The April morning was perfect for beginning work on the roof. The air was crisp but not cold, and the forecast promised clear skies all day. I assembled my ladder, gathered my tools, and climbed up to assess the damage. Several shingles were completely missing, and water damage had begun to seep into the attic. Nothing I could not handle myself. I had watched enough tutorials and possessed enough common sense to replace some shingles without hiring an expensive contractor. I worked methodically, carefully removing the damaged sections first. The physical labor felt good after years behind a desk. The rhythmic motion of hammering nails was almost meditative. For the first time in months, my mind felt clear. I hummed to myself as I worked, occasionally waving to neighbors who passed by. That was when I heard the sound of tires slowing on the gravel road. A white and blue patrol car pulled up alongside my front yard. I did not think much of it at first. Perhaps it was just a friendly welcome from local law enforcement. I offered a polite wave as a woman in a crisp tan uniform emerged from the vehicle. Her posture was rigid, her movements precise. The gold star on her chest caught the sunlight. Sheriff Sheila Barnett, according to the name emblazoned above her badge. "Hello there," I called down. "Beautiful day, is it not?" Her response was not the friendly greeting I had expected. "Do you have a permit for that structural work?" Her voice was sharp, authoritative. I paused, hammer in midair. "A permit? I am just replacing some damaged shingles." Sheriff Sheila adjusted her hat, shading her eyes as she looked up at me. "Any modifications to building structures in Millfield require proper permitting through the county office. That includes roofing work." I could not help but laugh, assuming this was some kind of small-town humor I was not yet privy to. "I am just fixing a few spots where shingles blew off. It is my house." Her expression did not change. Not even a hint of amusement crossed her face. "Sir, I do not appreciate your attitude. Town Ordinance 473 specifically prohibits unlicensed structural work on any building within township limits. That is a $500 fine and potential misdemeanor charges." My smile faded as I realized she was completely serious. "You want me to get a permit to fix my own roof, to replace maybe 10 shingles? The law does not make exceptions based on scope. You need certified approval from a building inspector and proper documentation filed with the county." She pulled out a small notepad and began writing. "I will issue you a citation today. All work must cease immediately until proper channels are followed." I carefully made my way down the ladder, thinking there must be some misunderstanding. "Look, Sheriff, I just moved back to take care of my uncle's place. I did not realize there were such strict rules about basic home maintenance." She tore the citation from her pad and extended it toward me. "Ignorance of local ordinances is not a valid defense. You have 72 hours to pay this fine and file for proper permitting, or further action will be taken." As I took the paper, I noticed something in her eyes, not duty or responsibility, but something closer to satisfaction. A small smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth as she watched my confusion turn to frustration. "Welcome to Millfield," she said, turning back toward her patrol car. "We expect our residents to follow the rules to the letter, no exceptions." I stood in my yard, citation in hand, watching as she drove away. The hammering from my neighbors' houses had mysteriously stopped. When I looked around, I noticed curtains quickly drawing closed and people retreating indoors. The street that had been active with weekend chores just minutes earlier was now eerily silent. Something about this interaction felt wrong, disproportionate, and personal, despite us being complete strangers. As I looked down at the citation with its excessive fine amount, I could not shake the feeling that fixing my roof was not the real issue. Sheriff Sheila had not been enforcing a code. She had been establishing dominance, and apparently this was just how things worked in Millfield now. The county administration building was a modest brick structure with American flags flanking the entrance. I arrived early Monday morning, citation in hand, determined to resolve this ridiculous situation. The permit office was located on the second floor, a small room with fluorescent lighting and faded motivational posters on the walls. A middle-aged woman with glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck barely looked up when I approached her desk. "I need to inquire about roofing permits," I said, sliding Sheriff Sheila's citation across the counter. "Apparently, I need official approval to replace a few damaged shingles on my own property." The clerk glanced at the citation, then at me, then back down at her computer screen. Her fingers paused over the keyboard. "New in town, are you?" "Just moved into my uncle's old place on Maple Street, Bill Henderson's house." Something flickered across her face, recognition, perhaps even sympathy. "I see. Well, roofing permits require an application form, proof of property ownership, detailed plans of the work to be done, and a $75 processing fee. Then there is the inspection fee, which is separate." I blinked in disbelief. All that to hammer down a few loose shingles. She lowered her voice slightly. "Those are the regulations as they currently stand. Can I speak with someone about possibly getting an exception? This seems excessive for minor repairs." The clerk's eyes darted toward the hallway, then back to me. "The building inspector is not in today. Perhaps you should just file the paperwork in." She hesitated, then pushed a stack of forms toward me. "It would be easier that way." As I filled out the overly complicated forms, another employee entered the room and whispered something to the clerk. I caught Sheriff Sheila's name in their hushed exchange. Both of them glanced at me before the second employee hurried out. The clerk's demeanor became even more distant after that interaction. When I tried to ask about the timeline for approval, she simply said, "It takes as long as it takes," and called the next person in line. I left the building with more questions than answers, and an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Outside on the steps of the administration building, an older man approached me. He had noticed my frustrated expression. "Permit troubles?" he asked, keeping his voice low. I nodded. All I want to do is fix a few shingles on my roof. Henderson's old place, right? I saw you moving in. He extended his hand. Carl Whitman, I live about a half-mile down from you. We shook hands and I introduced myself. Carl suggested we grab coffee at the diner across the street. Once seated in a corner booth, away from other patrons, his friendly expression gave way to concern. Listen, I should warn you about Sheriff Barnett. She has been problematic since taking office 3 years ago, especially with newcomers or anyone she perceives as not fitting her vision of what Millfield should be. Over roof repairs, I asked incredulously. It is never really about the thing she cites you for. Carl stirred his coffee absently. It is about control, power, making sure everyone knows who is in charge. Over the next hour, Carl shared stories that made my roofing citation seem trivial by comparison. He described how Sheriff Sheila had systematically targeted certain residents with selective enforcement of obscure ordinances, how complaints to the town council mysteriously disappeared, how those who spoke out often found themselves subject to traffic stops, property inspections, or worse. Would you like to see what happened when I built a garden shed last summer? Carl asked as we left the diner. He drove me to his property, a modest farmhouse similar to my uncle's place. In his backyard, partially covered by a blue tarp, was a pile of splintered wood and metal. Sheriff claimed it was 3 inches too close to the public right-of-way, came with 2 deputies and a bulldozer while I was at work. Carl's voice cracked slightly. 30 years I have lived here, never had a problem until she took the badge. As we stood looking at the remains of his shed, a patrol car cruised slowly past Carl's property. The driver was not Sheriff Sheila, but the message was clear. We were being watched. Why does nobody stop her? I asked once the patrol car had passed. Most of the old sheriff's deputies quit when she took over. She brought in her own people. The town council is scared of her, and folks around here cannot afford to fight legal battles, especially when the law enforcement is corrupt. Carl shook his head sadly. Most people just keep their heads down and hope she does not notice them. Later that afternoon, I witnessed Sheriff Sheila's tactics firsthand. I was picking up groceries at the local market when a commotion erupted outside. Sheriff Sheila had cornered a teenage girl with a bicycle near the store entrance. The girl could not have been more than 15, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. Town ordinance prohibits unattended bicycles in commercial zones, Sheriff Sheila was saying loudly, clearly performing for the small crowd gathering nearby. That is a $75 fine. But I was just going in to buy milk for my mom, the girl protested, her voice trembling. A woman hurried out of the store, presumably the girl's mother. Please, Sheriff, she was only going to be a minute. We live just down the street. Sheriff Sheila turned her cold stare to the mother. Perhaps you should teach your daughter to respect local ordinances, Mrs. Collins, unless you want me looking more closely at your property for other violations. The threat hung in the air. Mrs. Collins placed a protective arm around her daughter's shoulders and whispered something to her. The girl's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. We will pay the fine, Mrs. Collins said quietly. It will not happen again. As Sheriff Sheila wrote up the citation, her satisfaction was evident. This was not about bicycles or public safety. This was about demonstrating power, making an example of someone weaker to reinforce the control she held over the entire community. The crowd dispersed quickly once Sheriff Sheila finished, no one wanting to attract her attention. The girl and her mother hurried away, citation in hand, shoulders hunched in defeat. Their humiliation was palpable, and not a single bystander had intervened. In that moment, I understood what Carl had been trying to tell me. This town was not being protected by its sheriff. It was being held hostage by her. After witnessing Sheriff Sheila's public intimidation of the teenage girl, something shifted inside me. This was no longer about my roof or a citation. There was a systemic problem in Millfield, and no one seemed willing or able to address it. My journalistic instincts, dormant since leaving my investigative reporting job years ago, began to reawaken. I started with basic research. Public officials have records that are, by definition, public. Sheriff Sheila Barnett may have intimidated the townspeople into submission, but information had a way of coming to light if you knew where to look. I contacted an old college friend who now worked in public records administration for a neighboring county. "I need everything you can find on a Sheriff Sheila Barnett," I explained during our phone call. "Employment history, training certifications, prior postings, anything that might explain how she came to power in Millfield." 3 days later, an email arrived with several attachments. "This is strange," my friend wrote in the message body. "Her record is unusually sparse. No disciplinary actions, no complaints, barely any documentation at all before she appeared in Millfield. It is like someone scrubbed it clean." I pored over the documents, searching for anything that might offer insight. Her official biography claimed she had transferred from a department in the southern part of the state, but there were no specifics. No commendations, but also no reprimands. In a profession that generated paperwork for every interaction, Sheriff Sheila's history was suspiciously blank. This level of cleanliness was not normal, it was manufactured. Someone had gone to great lengths to sanitize her past. Marcus Whitley, an attorney friend from my reporting days, agreed to meet me for lunch in a neighboring town, safely outside Sheriff Sheila's jurisdiction. The restaurant was quiet, and we chose a booth in the back for privacy. "Based on what you have shown me," Marcus said after reviewing the documents, "I would bet my law license that records have been sealed or expunged. This level of blankness does not happen naturally, especially for someone in law enforcement." "How difficult would that be to accomplish?" I asked. "Very. You would need connections, money, or both. Judges do not typically seal records without compelling reasons, particularly for public officials." Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Whatever she is hiding, someone powerful helped her bury it." The next day, an unmarked envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address, no postmark. Someone had delivered it personally. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "She should not be in uniform. Check Riverside County, 2017, case number RC8834L." The handwriting on the envelope looked shaky, elderly. My thoughts immediately went to the retired deputies Carl had mentioned, those who had served under the previous sheriff and left when Sheila took command. That evening, I searched online for any mentions of Riverside County and the case number. Nothing appeared in official databases, but on an obscure forum dedicated to police accountability, I found a single post from 2018. RC8834L, Officer SB accused of excessive force and evidence tampering during DUI stop. Charges dismissed under unusual circumstances. Victim received settlement with NDA. Officer transferred out of county immediately after. System protecting its own again. The initials matched. The timeline aligned with Sheriff Sheila's mysterious appearance in Millfield. But without access to the sealed records, I had only fragments of information, not enough to confront her directly or bring to higher authorities. I needed more. Through a series of careful inquiries and the calling in of old journalistic favors, I managed to contact the lawyer who had represented the alleged victim in case RC 8834L. They refused to speak about specifics, citing the non-disclosure agreement, but their parting words were telling. Some people should never carry a badge. Unfortunately, the system makes it too easy for them to keep doing so, just somewhere else. Late one night, after weeks of research, another breakthrough came in the form of an email from a court clerk in Riverside County, someone who had taken pity on my persistent inquiries. The message contained no text, just an attachment, a scanned copy of a booking photo. There she was, Sheriff Sheila Barnett in handcuffs, her expression not fearful or remorseful but coldly defiant even then. The charge sheet was partially redacted, but the words assault, falsification, and obstruction were clearly visible. She had not just been accused. She had been arrested, charged, and somehow, through connections or intimidation, had managed to have it all erased, the record sealed, allowing her to simply move to another jurisdiction and start fresh with a clean slate. The pieces were falling into place. Sheriff Sheila was not just a power-hungry, small-town tyrant. She was potentially a criminal hiding behind a badge, using her position to bully others while concealing her own corrupt past. I printed the booking photo and supporting documents, placing them in a secure folder. Then I made digital copies, storing them in multiple locations online. If anything happened to me, the information would not disappear. The truth about Sheriff Sheila Barnett would come to light one way or another. What I did not realize was how quickly that confrontation would come. The very next morning, as I was compiling my evidence, multiple patrol cars pulled into my driveway, lights flashing. Through my front window, I could see Sheriff Sheila stepping out of the lead vehicle, adjusting her hat, a cold smile playing on her lips as she approached my door. The pounding on my door was unnecessarily forceful, 3 sharp raps that seemed designed to intimidate rather than announce. I took a deep breath, slipped my phone into my shirt pocket with the camera facing outward, and pressed the record button. Then I opened the door. Sheriff Sheila stood on my porch, flanked by 2 deputies. Her posture was rigid, authoritative. Behind them, a small crowd of neighbors had begun to gather at the edges of my property, watching with concern and curiosity. "Good morning, Sheriff," I said calmly. "What brings you here today?" "You have been issued multiple citations for continued unpermitted structural work on this property," she replied, her voice carrying across the yard for the benefit of the onlookers. "I have documentation here showing you have failed to comply with cease and desist orders." This was categorically false. I had not touched the roof since receiving the original citation. In fact, I had been so focused on investigating Sheriff Sheila that home repairs had been entirely neglected. "That is incorrect," I responded. "I have not done any work on the property since your original citation. I filed the permit paperwork as required." She smirked. "We have photographic evidence and eyewitness testimony stating otherwise. You are being placed under arrest for willful violation of building codes and obstruction of justice." Before I could protest further, she nodded to her deputies. One grabbed my arm while the other produced handcuffs. The cold metal clamped around my wrists as Sheriff Sheila continued her performance for the growing audience. "This is the kind of disregard for law and order that threatens the safety and integrity of our community," she proclaimed loudly. "No one is above the rules in Millfield." I remained silent as they led me toward the patrol car, acutely aware that my phone was still recording. Sheriff Sheila was clearly attempting to humiliate me publicly, to make an example that would reinforce her authority. What she did not realize was that she was providing me with exactly the evidence I needed. As they paraded me across my front lawn, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Collins, the mother of the teenage girl who had been cited for her bicycle, stepped forward from the crowd. "Why are you arresting him?" she asked, her voice trembling but determined. "All he did was try to fix his roof." Sheriff Sheila's expression hardened. "Ma'am, this is an official police matter. Please return to your home." Another voice joined in Carl's. "We would like to know what specific code he violated. As taxpayers, we have a right to that information." Others began murmuring, emboldened by these first challenges to Sheriff Sheila's authority. A young man near the back of the gathering held up his phone, clearly recording the scene. Sheriff Sheila noticed and faltered momentarily. "Deputy Morris, please ask these people to disperse," she ordered, her voice less confident than before. The deputy looked uncomfortable. "They are on public property, Sheriff. They have a right to observe from the sidewalk." Sheriff Sheila's face flushed with anger. She grabbed my arm roughly and pulled me toward her patrol car, away from the crowd. Once we were partially shielded by the vehicle, she leaned in close, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "I do not know what you think you are doing in my town, but it ends now. You have no idea who you are dealing with." I met her gaze steadily. "Actually, Sheriff Barnett, I know exactly who I am dealing with, including what happened in Riverside County in 2017. The color drained from her face. For a brief moment, her carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing genuine fear beneath the arrogance. She quickly recovered, but not before I had witnessed her momentary panic. "Put him in the back," she ordered the deputy, then turned to address the crowd. "This matter will be handled according to proper legal procedures. Everyone needs to clear the area now." As the deputy helped me into the patrol car, I noticed several people had their phones out, recording everything. The live stream from my own phone was capturing not just video, but the clear audio of Sheriff Sheila's threats. Technology had created witnesses that could not be intimidated. At the station, Sheriff Sheila processed my paperwork with cold efficiency, charging me with multiple code violations and obstruction. But something had changed. The deputies exchanged uncomfortable glances when they thought she was not looking. One of them even subtly loosened my handcuffs when Sheriff Sheila stepped away. 3 hours later, I was released with a citation and court date. No formal arrest was processed. Sheriff Sheila had clearly realized that detaining me further would only draw more attention to a situation she was losing control of. When I returned home, my phone had hundreds of notifications. The live stream had been shared across local social media groups. Residents were discussing not just my situation, but sharing their own experiences with Sheriff Sheila's selective enforcement and intimidation tactics. I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing the footage from my phone. Every word, every threat, every false accusation was clearly documented. Sheriff Sheila had made a critical error in judgment by attempting to publicly humiliate me. She had provided the perfect platform for exposing her abuse of power. That evening, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I had enough evidence to show a pattern of harassment and abuse of authority. But the sealed records from Riverside were the key piece, proof that Sheriff Sheila's past contained serious misconduct that should have prevented her from ever wearing a badge again. Releasing sealed records potentially crossed legal lines, but allowing a corrupt officer to continue terrorizing an entire community crossed moral ones. The people of Millfield deserved to know the truth about the woman who held such power over their lives. With careful consideration, I created an anonymous online profile and uploaded the booking photo and partially redacted case information. The caption was simple but devastating. "This is who runs your town." Within hours, the post had been shared hundreds of times across local groups. Phone calls and text messages flooded in from neighbors and community members I had never even met. The long-suppressed conversations about Sheriff Sheila's conduct had finally found a public forum. The dam of fear had broken, and the truth was flowing freely at last. By morning, local news outlets had picked up the story. Reporters were requesting statements from the town council, the county commissioners, and Sheriff Sheila herself. Her carefully constructed kingdom of intimidation was crumbling around her, one shared post at a time. The emergency town council meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, just 5 days after I released the documents. The town hall, normally a quiet venue for mundane discussions about road maintenance and zoning issues, was filled beyond capacity. People stood along the walls and spilled out into the hallway. The energy in the room was electric, charged with years of suppressed grievances finally finding voice. I arrived early, securing a seat near the front. Carl sat beside me, his weathered face set with determination. Across the aisle, Mrs. Collins and her daughter waited quietly, a folder of documents clutched tightly in the mother's hands. Throughout the room, I recognized faces from my brief time in Millfield, neighbors who had watched silently as Sheriff Sheila had handcuffed me on my own property, store owners who had averted their eyes when she entered their establishments, elderly residents who remembered what the town had been like before her arrival. Mayor Williams called the meeting to order, his voice strained. Due to recent allegations and public concern regarding the conduct of Sheriff Sheila Barnett, this emergency session will address questions about law enforcement practices in our community. The side door opened and Sheriff Sheila entered the room. She wore her full uniform, badge polished to a high shine. Her expression was composed, but I noticed the tightness around her mouth, the slightly too rigid posture. She took her seat at the table facing the council, carefully avoiding eye contact with the audience. Over the next 2 hours, residents stepped forward one by one to share their experiences. Carl described the destruction of his garden shed in meticulous detail, presenting before and after photographs and copies of the obscure ordinance Sheriff Sheila had cited. Mrs. Collins recounted the bicycle incident, her voice breaking as she described how her daughter now refused to ride her bike at all, too afraid of further harassment. A former deputy, now retired, testified about the dramatic shift in department culture after Sheriff Sheila took command. It was no longer about serving the community, he explained. It became about control, about making examples of people. Throughout these testimonies, Sheriff Sheila remained outwardly calm, occasionally writing notes or whispering to the attorney seated beside her. But I could see the tension building in her clenched jaw, in the whiteness of her knuckles as she gripped her pen. When my turn came, I approached the podium with the evidence I had gathered. Methodically, I presented documentation of selective enforcement patterns, statistical analysis showing disproportionate citations issued to newcomers and those who questioned authority, and testimony from neighboring jurisdictions about unusual practices in Millfield's Sheriff Department. And finally, I concluded, there is the matter of Sheriff Barnett's concealed history in Riverside County. At this, Sheriff Sheila stood abruptly. This is slander. Those records were legally sealed by court order. Which raises the question, I continued calmly, of why such records would need to be sealed in the first place, and whether the Millfield Town Council was informed of their existence during the hearing process. Mayor Williams looked genuinely shocked. The council was told Sheriff Barnett had an exemplary record with no disciplinary actions or complaints. Sheriff Sheila's attorney leaned over, whispering urgently in her ear, but she brushed him off. Her composure was cracking visibly now, her face flushed with anger. "You have no right to dig into my past," she said, her voice rising. "Everything I have done in this town has been by the book. Every citation, every arrest, all of it legal and proper." "Legal perhaps, but selective and abusive," I responded. "You have systematically targeted those you perceive as threats to your authority while ignoring actual issues that affect public safety." She slammed her hand on the table. "This community was falling apart before I took charge. None of you understand what it takes to maintain order, to enforce the rules that keep society functioning." "Is that what happened in Riverside?" I asked quietly. "Were you maintaining order when you were arrested for assault and falsification of evidence?" The room fell silent. Sheriff Sheila's face contorted with rage, her careful facade finally shattering completely. "You know nothing about what happened there. Nothing." Her voice echoed through the chamber. "These people needed someone to take control, to show them how a proper community functions. They should be grateful for everything I have done." In that moment of uncontrolled fury, Sheriff Sheila revealed her true nature more effectively than any evidence I could have presented. The mask of professional law enforcement had fallen away, exposing the person beneath, someone who viewed power not as a responsibility but as a personal right, who saw rules as weapons to wield against others rather than protections for all. Mayor Williams cleared his throat, clearly shaken by the outburst. "In light of these allegations and concerns about temperament, I move that Sheriff Barnett be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation by state authorities." The council vote was unanimous. Sheriff Sheila stood frozen for a moment, disbelief evident in her expression. Then, with deliberate movements, she unpinned the gold star from her uniform and placed it on the table before her. "You will regret this," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "All of you." But her threats no longer carried weight. As she walked toward the exit, the crowd parted silently, their fear replaced by something new, the quiet strength of a community reclaiming its voice. 1 week later, a team from the state attorney general's office arrived in Millfield. They set up temporary offices in the town hall, interviewing residents and reviewing years of records. Every citation, every arrest under Sheriff Sheila's administration was scrutinized for patterns of abuse or misconduct. The investigation uncovered systematic targeting of specific residents, evidence of falsified reports, and inappropriate use of county resources for personal vendettas. Most damning was the discovery that Sheriff Sheila had deliberately concealed her Riverside history from the hearing committee, a direct violation of state law regarding law enforcement appointments. Criminal charges were filed. The seal on her Riverside records was lifted as part of the broader investigation, revealing the full extent of her previous misconduct. Former victims, emboldened by Millfield's example, came forward with their own testimonies. As winter approached, I finally completed the repairs on my uncle's roof. Carl helped me, along with several other neighbors. We worked together under clear skies, no fear of patrol cars or arbitrary citations looming over us. The simple task that had started it all, replacing a few damaged shingles, had uncovered something far more damaged in the fabric of the community itself. Millfield was healing now, slowly rebuilding trust among its residents and in its institutions. The new interim sheriff, a longtime deputy from the neighboring county with an actual, verifiable record of community service, had already implemented reforms in department policies and practices. As I hammered the final nail into place, I reflected on how close this town had come to surrendering completely to fear and intimidation, how easily rights and freedoms can be eroded when power goes unchecked, and how important it is that someone, anyone, finds the courage to stand up and say, "Enough." Sometimes the most important repairs are not to our homes, but to the communities in which we live.